and to reach a peaceful resolution through the implementation of the UN Security Council Resolution 1701. And as we continue to work with our allies and partners to push for a diplomatic solution, we nonetheless stand ready for the worst-case scenario, including the potential evacuation of British nationals. And our message to those still in Lebanon remains clear: leave now. Mr. Speaker, our common goal of peace in the Middle East will never be lasting until there is safety, security and sovereignty for both Israel and a Palestinian state. We must all keep at the forefront of our minds the pain, the anguish, the horror that this conflict has caused for so many ordinary civilians. The victims of the October the 7th atrocity, the hostages, and all those still enduring unimaginable suffering, whether they're hoping to see their loved ones again or mourning their loss, as the tragic events of this weekend illustrate, as the bodies of 6 murdered hostages were recovered. The Israeli people still living under rocket fire, not only from Hamas, but from other hostile actors explicitly dedicated to Israel's annihilation, fighting an enemy in Hamas whose appalling tactics endanger countless civilian lives. And the innocent Palestinians, tens of thousands killed in the fighting, their numbers growing by the day, including distressing numbers of women and children, many mothers so malnourished they cannot produce milk for their babies, families struggling to keep their children alive, disease and famine looming ever larger, heroic humanitarians putting their lives on the line to help others, like the brave aid workers I met from the United Nations agencies, and from the Palestinian Red Crescent Society warehouse I visited alongside France's foreign minister last month. Indeed, last Thursday, the UK led a session at the United Nations Security Council, encouraging a continued global focus on the protection of civilians in Gaza, including the need for action on polio. And now, deeply worrying, the escalation we're seeing in the West Bank as well as in Gaza, with many communities facing settler violence amid an ongoing occupation, and so many on either side of this terrible conflict convinced that the world does not grasp the reality of Israel's predicament or the depth of Palestinian suffering. Throughout my life, I have been a friend of Israel, a liberal, progressive Zionist who believes in Israel as a democratic state and a homeland for the Jewish people, which has both the right to exist and defend itself. But I believe also that Israel will only exist in safety and security if there is a two-state solution that guarantees the rights of all Israeli citizens and their Palestinian neighbours, who have their own inalienable right to self-determination and security. Mr. Speaker, as concern at the horrifying scenes in Gaza has risen, many in this House, as well as esteemed lawyers and international organisations, have raised British arms export licensing to Israel. After raising my own concerns from opposition on taking office, I immediately sought to update the review. And on my first appearance as Foreign Secretary in this House, I committed to sharing the review's conclusions. We have rigorously followed every stage of the process which the previous Conservative government established. And let me first be clear on the review's scope. This government is not an international court. We have not and could not arbitrate on whether or not Israel has breached international humanitarian law. This is a forward-looking evaluation, not a determination of innocence or guilt, and it does not prejudge any future determinations by the competent courts. But facing a conflict such as this, it is this government's legal duty to review export licences. Criteria 2C of the Strategic Export Licensing Criteria states that the government will not issue export licences if there is a clear risk that the items might be used to commit or facilitate serious violations of international humanitarian law. It is with regret that I inform the House today the assessment I have received leaves me unable to conclude anything other than that for certain UK arms exports to Israel, there does exist a clear risk that they might be used to commit or facilitate a serious violation of international humanitarian law. I have informed my Right Honourable friend, the Business and Trade Secretary, and he is therefore today announcing the suspension of around 30 from a total of approximately 350 to Israel as required under the Export Controls Act. These include equipment that we assess is for use in the current conflict in Gaza, such as important components which go into military aircraft, including fighter aircraft, helicopters and drones, as well as items which facilitate ground targeting. And for transparency, this government is publishing a summary of our assessment. Today I want to underline 4 points about these decisions. First, Israel's actions in Gaza continue to lead to immense loss of civilian life, widespread destruction to civilian infrastructure, and immense suffering. In many cases, it's not been possible to reach a determinative conclusion on allegations regarding Israel's conduct of hostilities, in part because there is insufficient information either from Israel or other reliable sources to verify such claims. Nevertheless, it is the assessment of His Majesty's government that Israel could reasonably do more to ensure life-saving food and medical supplies reach civilians in Gaza, in light of the appalling humanitarian situation. And this government is also deeply concerned by credible claims of mistreatment of detainees, which the International Committee of the Red Cross cannot investigate after being denied access to places of detention. Both my predecessor and all our major allies have repeatedly and forcefully raised these concerns with the Israeli government. Regrettably, they have not been addressed satisfactorily. Second, there can be no doubt that Hamas pays not the slightest heed to international humanitarian law and endangers civilians by embedding itself in the tightly concentrated civilian population and in civilian infrastructure. There is no equivalence between Hamas terrorists and Israel's democratic government, or indeed Iran and their partners and proxies. But to license arms exports to Israel, we must assess their compliance with international humanitarian law, notwithstanding the abhorrence of their opponents' tactics and ideology. Third, this is not a blanket ban. This is not an arms embargo. It targets around 30, approximately 350 licenses to Israel in total for items which could be used in the current conflict in Gaza. The rest will continue. Neither will the action we are taking have a material impact on Israel's security. This suspension only covers items which might be used in the current conflict. There are a number of export licenses which we have assessed are not for military use in the current conflict and therefore do not require suspension, and these include items that are not being used by the Israel Defence Forces in the current conflict, such as trainee aircraft or other naval equipment. And these also include export licenses for civilian use, covering a range of products such as food testing chemicals, telecoms and data equipment. Nor will it prejudge the international collaboration global F-35 programme that supplies aircraft for more than 20 countries. And that is crucial to wider peace and security. Indeed, the effects of suspending all licenses for the F-35 programme would undermine the global F-35 supply chain that is vital for the security of the UK, our allies and NATO. Therefore, the Business and Trade Secretary has exempted these licenses from his decision. Fourth, the government will keep our position under review. Commitment to comply with international humanitarian law is not the only criteria in making export licensing decisions. We will continue to work with our allies to improve the situation, and foreign policy, of course, involves tough choices. But I will always seek to take such decisions in line with our principles, and I will keep this House updated in line with the previous commitment. Mr. Speaker, we do not take this decision lightly, but we note that on previous occasions, ministers from all sides of the House, Labour, Conservative and Liberal Democrat, chose not to license exports to Israel. In 1982, Margaret Thatcher imposed a full arms embargo and oil embargo on Israel as they fought in Lebanon. Conflicts in Gaza prompted Gordon Brown to suspend 5 licences in 2009, and Vince Cable chose not to issue new licences while conducting a review in 2014. Like them, this government takes seriously its role in applying export licensing law, reflecting the published criteria and the specific circumstances. But let me leave this House in no doubt. The UK continues to support Israel's right to self-defence in accordance with international law. In April, British fighter jets intercepted Iranian missiles aimed at Israel, preventing significant loss of civilian life. We supported robust action against the Iranian-backed Houthis in Yemen, who have attacked Israel directly as well as Israel-linked shipping. And Iran should be in no doubt of our commitment to challenge their reckless and destabilising activity in the region and across the world. We will continue to work hand in glove with our international partners to stand up to Iranian aggression and malign activity wherever it is found. And we continue to hold Iran to account, including through extensive sanctions. And today, we're doing so again. We're announcing new sanctions on 4 IRGC force targets who have a role in supporting Iranian proxy actions in Iraq, Syria and Lebanon through the UK's dedicated Iran sanctions regime. We've sanctioned over 400 Iranian individuals and entities. And through our work with partners, we are exposing and containing Iran's destabilising weapons development, where soon we'll be introducing further regulations to bolster existing bans on the export of goods and technology significant to Iran's production of drones and missiles. So let me be clear. We will continue to work with Israel and our partners to tackle the threat from Iran across the region. This government will continue to stand for Israel's security, and we will always do so in a manner consistent with our obligations to domestic and international law. Mr. Speaker, I commend this statement to the House.
I now call the Shadow Foreign Secretary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and may I thank the Foreign Secretary for advance sight of his statement. Mr. Speaker, over the weekend we were once again reminded of the tragic human toll of this conflict, with Israel recovering the bodies of 6 more innocent hostages murdered by Hamas. The only way, Mr. Speaker, this conflict will be brought to an end and for the suffering to end is through the release of those hostages. This cruel captivity has lasted almost a year. Their suffering and jeopardy is intolerable for Israel, and it should be intolerable for anyone who cares about human rights and human dignity. Many of us in this House have met with the families of the hostages, even in the midst of unimaginable pain and anxiety. They keep the torch burning for their loved ones, publicly highlighting their plight and tremendous bravery. And let us be clear, Mr. Speaker, the onus is on Hamas. They are using the Palestinian people as human shields. Hamas has no humanity and it has no shame. And as Hamas inflicts terrible suffering on both the Israeli and Palestinian people, it should not be forgotten that another Iranian-backed proxy, Hezbollah, is engaged in continuous attacks on Israel's northern border, with the risk of further and yet more dangerous escalation across the blue line. Our support for Israel's security is rock solid in the face of threats from those who wish it serious harm, just as we showed in April this year when British personnel and weaponry were used to counter Iran's massive missile attack. We will look carefully, Mr. Speaker, at the limited arms embargo memorandum that the Foreign Secretary has promised the House. While he rightly does not publish his legal advice, we are grateful that he is honouring the promise I gave to the Business and Trade Committee on publishing as much as possible on this. And he will, I know, and as he said, be careful not to indicate in any way at all any moral equivalence between Hamas and the democratically elected government of Israel. In government, Mr. Speaker, we introduced sanctions to undermine Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad. We also sanctioned extremist Israeli settlers who committed human rights abuses against Palestinian communities in the West Bank. And we welcome the new sanctions the Foreign Secretary has announced today on 4 IRGC Quds Force targets. Mr. Speaker, implementation of the UN Security Council Resolution 1701 remains our best hope of de-escalation and peace along the Blue Line. Resolution 1701 provides a roadmap which everyone should seek to follow, and we welcome the government's reaffirmation of its support for Resolution 1701. In relation to British nationals in Lebanon, it is very much our hope that since the House last considered this matter, shortly before the recess, the number of Brits who have registered their presence in Lebanon and departed from the country has risen. Mr. Speaker, I want to reiterate that the situation in the West Bank has also deteriorated and become yet more tense. While Israel must protect its vital security interests, we urge the Netanyahu government to do so in such a way that minimises the risk of yet further instability and escalation. Turning finally to the humanitarian crisis in Gaza, we want to convey our thanks to the WHO and UNICEF staff who have been racing to get polio vaccinations administered across Gaza. They are doing vital work during this agreed pause. And pauses offer the potential, Mr. Speaker, to get much needed humanitarian aid in, but also a window to get the hostages out. And pauses can help create the conditions necessary to bring about a sustainable peace. And on the distribution of aid, we strongly support calls for watertight deconfliction processes and the utmost protection of aid workers. Humanitarian aid can only make a difference if it is properly and safely distributed. Guaranteed deconfliction for aid convoys and other humanitarian work is absolutely essential. It is by road and truck that aid must be able to reach Gaza by all routes. This should make humanitarian aid delivery by air and sea unnecessary. Could the Foreign Secretary provide the House with more detail about how we are playing our part in international efforts to get more aid over the border to desperate people? To conclude, Mr. Speaker, we all want the terrible suffering of both the Israeli and Palestinian people to end. It does feel as if we are at a point where this conflict could go in two radically different directions. While the region faces a potential conflagration, it is also possible that cooler heads on all sides might prevail. Britain's role must be to help facilitate a sustainable end to the current suffering. It is only then that we can achieve our aim of lifting people's eyes to the prospect of a different horizon in the future.
Secretary.
Well, I'm grateful, Mr. Speaker, to the Shadow Foreign Secretary for the tone of his response. He will know, as well as anyone, that these are complex and sober questions, and it's right that the House can debate them in the appropriate tone and spirit this afternoon. And I recall that Lord Cameron said that he was concerned that Israel had violated international humanitarian law, that the Shadow Foreign Secretary himself has repeatedly called on Israel to abide by international humanitarian law, and said that in certain actions that they may not have complied with international humanitarian law. And in April, the Shadow Minister, the Honourable Member for Rutland and Stamford, who was in her seat slightly earlier, said that the UK had no choice but to suspend arms. So he can recognise that this is not a partisan issue, and I'm very grateful for the tone that he's taken in this debate. I have provided the House with a summary today on the issue of the way that I have made the assessment, and indeed in doing so I have been more transparent than any government has been in the past about decisions like this, because I recognise the exceptional public interest there is in this debate. He's right, like me, to underline that there is no moral equivalence between Hamas, who began this atrocity on October the 7th, and the prosecution of getting those hostages out and defending itself, even though that I have said that there is a clear risk in relation to our export licensing regime. He's right to talk about the context in Lebanon. to support, indeed, the government's message that UK nationals should leave. And let me assure him that I have not just visited Lebanon now on many occasions, but spoken to the Lebanese Prime Minister on 3 occasions just in the last few weeks. And of course, in the West Bank, we recognise the important security concerns of Israel, but we are deeply concerned with the way that we see these actions being prosecuted over the last few days, and we call for de-escalation. And of course, in terms of the situation in Gaza, successive foreign secretaries now have raised with the Israelis, and I raised it directly with Prime Minister Netanyahu, that not enough trucks are getting in. And it is still the case today, after 11 months of conflict, that not enough trucks are getting in. And the Minister for Development was in Jordan, assessing the situation from there, as I was just before that with the Red Crescent. It has been important for us to demonstrate leadership in the UN and to press to get these pauses so the children of Gaza can be vaccinated against polio. We have that pause in place, I think, between 8 a.m. and 2 a.m. Or 2 p.m. In the afternoon, so that those children can get the vaccinations they need so that they don't suffer.
John Butler.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Secretary of State, for your important statement today. It is clear, and I agree with the Shadow Minister, that Hamas has no humanity and no shame. Some have said that there's only a pause to vaccinate children because polio may spread beyond Gaza. With so many children killed in this war, I understand why some may say that. The World Health Organization says that at least 90% of children under 10 must be immunized in a very short period of time. With that in mind, can the Secretary of State please tell the House what measures this government is taking to ensure further agreements are made to have a pause for as long as possible that both sides can adhere to?
Well, I'm grateful to my honourable friend, and I was very pleased to meet with the member for Oxford East, with Dr. Tedros, who leads the World Health Organization, to discuss these issues and his particular concerns about disease and polio in the area. We continue to press for a ceasefire. We are working with all colleagues to get that ceasefire. Just before coming to this House, President Biden has confirmed that the ceasefire is within reach. And I urge all sides now to make that ceasefire happen and bring these horrors to an end and get those hostages out.
Lib Dem spokesperson Layla Moran.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This week we received the terrible news of the deaths of 6 Israeli hostages, among them Hirsch Goldberg-Polin, whose mother Rachel I met when I was last in Jerusalem. I cannot imagine her pain. And that pain is not diluted by the pain of so many others. Yes, other Israeli hostage families, but also thousands of families in Gaza for the dead there. And to all, I'm sure, we send our deepest condolences. In the West Bank, we have seen horrific violence as Israeli forces launched an operation inside refugee camps, terrifying children in their beds and accused of breaking their own codes of conduct. The situation seems to only go from bad to worse. So I welcome the Foreign Secretary's remarks about the suspension of some arms exports licenses to the IDF. But given the seriousness of the ICC and the ICJ cases, there remain questions about the many hundreds of others. So I look forward to reading the published summary. I urge the government to go further. Will they not ban goods produced in the illegal Israeli settlements? If the settlements are illegal, why are we allowing trade with them? And will they sanction Ben-Gvir and Smotrich, as the EU's Joseph Borrell is considering? Or can he at least say that when it comes to violent extremists, nothing and no one is off the table? Speaking in December last year, Hirsch's mother, Rachel, said to the UN General Assembly, "We are at a crossroads." And when I say we, I don't mean Jews, Muslims or Christians, Americans, Palestinians, Europeans, Israelis, Ukrainian, Russians. I mean we humans. We can keep dividing the world into the paradigm of them versus us, or we can start thinking about those who are willing and those who are not. This could have all been so different. Imagine if the world had listened to her then in December. And so I urge the government, be bolder. That is the only way to make that promise of peace a reality. And that, of course, has to start, rather than end, with that immediate ceasefire.
Foreign Secretary.
I'm grateful to the Right Honourable Lady. And let me just say on the hostages that I've now personally spoken to or met all of the British and UK-linked hostages and heard for myself the suffering that they've endured since their loved ones were taken on the 7th of October. There needs to be an end to this nightmare. And there is now tremendous grief, pain and trauma whenever you visit Israel and meet with hostage families, as I have continued to do. She's right to raise the issues on the West Bank. We are deeply concerned by the ongoing IDF military operation in the occupied West Bank and the attacks from Palestinian militants. We recognise, of course, the need to defend itself, Israel's need to defend itself against security threats, but we are deeply worried by the methods that Israel's employed and by reports of civilian casualties and the destruction of civilian infrastructure particularly. It's in no one's interest to further conflict and instability to spread that to the West Bank. We condemn the settler expansion, the record levels that we've seen this year particularly, and of course the increase in settler violence. And I condemn the language that's been used by ministers in the Israeli government, Smodrik, Ben-Gvir, particularly in relation to this. It's entirely unacceptable language and should be condemned by the government or the Israeli government as a whole. She raises important issues and she recognised that, of course, in terms of labelling, we do label in relation to goods from settlements alongside the 1967 borders particularly, but the issues are very, very complex.
Kim Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The escalation of military violence in the West Bank has led to the reported deaths of Palestinians and increased settler violence, resulting in illegal occupation and violent land theft. Amid this escalation, the US has imposed sanctions on Israeli groups. Medical Aid Palestine have claimed the UK government has not acted with due urgency. So, can the Foreign Secretary clarify the government's position on this issue and what immediate actions the government will be taking other than condemnation of this action?
Well,
Foreign Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, can I reassure my honourable friend that we are keeping this under review? We are in dialogue with our closest allies on this issue, and we will not flinch in dealing with the issues at hand if we need to.
Sir Julian Lewis.
Can the Foreign Secretary assure the House that what appears to be a carefully calibrated response to a dreadful situation will not in any way impair the valuable cooperation between Israel and the United Kingdom, where the sharing of intelligence about international terrorist activity is concerned?
Foreign Secretary.
Well, the Right Honourable Gentleman is amongst the very few in this House who understand the breadth and depth and importance for our own national security of that relationship. We have a very important people-to-people relationship with Israel. 250 UK Jewish nationals here in this country. We have a very important trading relationship with Israel, but the cooperation on intelligence, military and security is essential, not just to our national interests, but to the global security of much of the world. And so I've made this decision with regret. It's in sorrow, not in anger. And he will understand that others, in fact Conservative governments, have gone for a full arms embargo. We have not done that today because we recognise with Hezbollah, with the Houthis, with Hamas, it is right that Israel has the means to defend itself.
Emily Thornbury.
Mr. Speaker, could my right honourable friend just reiterate the very important point, which is this is not an arms embargo on Israel. We continue to support Israel's right to defend itself and will continue to sell it arms, but that the rules underpinning our control of arms are as they have always been, which is that the UK will not permit the sale of arms if they might be used for internal repression or international aggression. And for that reason, we have cut the number of arms export licences by 30.
Secretary of State.
Well, my right honourable friend spent a few more years at the bar than I did. And she knows that in making this very sober assessment, it is based, Mr. Speaker, on a clear risk. And on the basis of that clear risk, it is arms and weaponry that may be used in Gaza that we have sought, and it amounts to around 30 that we have sought to suspend. It's of course our sincere hope that we get to that ceasefire and the sustained position that will allow us, of course, to resume working in the way that we would normally work with our Israeli friends.
Walters.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I too met the mother of Hirsch Goldberg-Polin in Jerusalem, and it's a terrible tragedy that his name has joined the list of many thousands of innocents who've died in this conflict over the last few months on both sides. Now, the Secretary of State will know that I've been long concerned about the situation in the West Bank, and I understand that the measures he's taken today, and indeed sanctions generally, are not purely performative. He wants them to have some bite. So I wanted to ask you about the case of Hilltop Youth. Today. This organisation, violent settler organisation, was sanctioned by the previous government earlier this year and was recently described as a bunch of terrorists by the head of the Internal Security Service in Israel. And yet our sanctions seemingly have had no impact on their behaviour or their conduct and the violent persecution that they're visiting upon innocent Palestinians in the West Bank. So will he consider extending our sanctions to those who support and sustain this organisation and others, both within Israel and externally? Because if we're going to be taken seriously on an international stage, whether it's in Iran, in the case of Iran, or these violent organisations, our measures have to have bite and effect, and at the moment, seemingly, they aren't.
Foreign Secretary.
Well, the right honourable gentleman who has raised these issues consistently in this House now over many years is absolutely right to draw focus to what is happening on the West Bank. And that is not because of the immediate violence that we've seen over the last 2 days. It's because the level of violence, the expansion, the sense of impunity that one sees when one is in the West Bank is of huge concern. Can I reassure him that I continue to work with allies and I continue to keep these matters under close review?
Andy MacDonald.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank the Foreign Secretary for his statement. I speak as a long-term friend of Palestine and an advocate of a two-state solution. I'm sure you'd agree with me when it comes to the release of hostages. We want to see all hostages released in their hundreds and thousands. But I'd ask him particularly what assessment he's made of the impact of his suspension of 30 of these licences, because Israel has shown little sign of responding to pressure from the outside world, and along with the Oxford and Abingdon. What further steps is he prepared to take? Because we see in the West Bank these egregious behaviours, and is it really conscionable that Israel is going to respond in a favourable way to the limited but welcome announcement that he's made today?
Foreign Secretary.
What can I say to my honourable friend? I know the strength with which he talks about these issues and has talked consistently about them over many, many years. Let me just make clear that the announcement, Mr. Speaker, that I make today follows a process. It's a process that was set up by the last government in 2021. We have followed that process to the law, and that is why I'm here today. It is in no way to punish Israel. That is not the point of the process. It is to make sure that our export licensing regime remains amongst the very robust in the world. And I recognise what he says about the West Bank particularly, and it's why I went to the region just a few weeks ago once again.
Brendan O'Hara.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Foreign Secretary for prior sight of the statement. And of course, we welcome anything which reduces the appalling death toll in Gaza and increasingly, sadly, in the West Bank. But this statement raises so many questions which I will write to the Foreign Secretary about later. But could I press him on the issue of the UK recognising that the Netanyahu government's use of UK weapons poses a clear risk of the violation of international humanitarian law? You'll be aware that there is no legal definition between what is an offensive weapon and what is a defensive weapon. So why and on what basis, if there is, in his words, a clear risk of the violation of international humanitarian law, why has he not imposed a blanket ban on Israel until that risk has gone away completely?
Foreign Secretary.
Well, can I say to the honourable gentleman that we have one of the most robust export licensing regimes in the world. The process requires us to make an assessment about the clear risk in the theatre of conflict. And the theatre of conflict in relation to this is Gaza. And therefore we have made an assessment on the basis of the licences that could be used in Gaza, and I've made the announcement that I've made today. But I think that the honourable gentleman, in the thrust of his remarks, notwithstanding the concerns around international humanitarian law in that theatre of action, should recognise the real threats that Israel faces from Lebanese Hezbollah, should recognise what the Houthis are doing now in the Red Sea, and recently we saw this terrible attack on a Greek oil tanker just over the last few days, and recognise the long-standing relationship that this country has with Israel, and particularly in relation to intelligence and military accession that keeps much of the Middle East and the world safe. And it's for that basis that my remarks are measured, and I defend that.
Laura Kirk-Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I welcome the Foreign Secretary's decision to suspend certain arms sales to Israel. I also appreciate his acknowledgement that Israel could do much more to allow aid to reach people in Gaza. I'd like to ask the Foreign Secretary what further conversations he's had with the Israeli government to ask them to ensure that aid workers are able to do their vital work safely and effectively, and that aid can get to those who desperately need it.
Foreign Secretary.
Well, can I say to my honourable friend that the issue of aid workers and the tremendous loss of life of aid workers in this conflict is an issue I have raised directly in all of my meetings with the Israeli government. And there's another issue that sits alongside this, and it's the issue of deconfliction. It must be the case that in any war there are rules. And one of the rules are that aid workers are able to get medical supplies and aid to the civilians that need it. And there have been real issues with deconfliction zones and the amount of aid workers who've died and the amount of UN workers who've died in this conflict. She's absolutely right to raise it.
Sammy Wilson.
Madam Speaker. The only people who will be overjoyed by this decision today will be the Hamas terrorists who murdered in cold blood 6 hostages at the weekend. They have been handed a line of hope that this government will not stand firm in its defence of Israel's right to defend itself. And let's look at the threadbare arguments that the Minister has used today. That these arms might be used to breach international humanitarian law. And yet he admits that the government cannot arbitrate as to whether or not Israel has done so to date. That civilian deaths have been caused. And yet, hardly a couple of paragraphs later in this statement, the Minister states that the civilian deaths have been a result of Hamas embedding itself in the civilian population with no regard for those people who have been affected. And the last reason he gives then is that Israel is responsible for these deaths, even though he again admits that it is not possible to determine who is responsible for these deaths, and indeed how many deaths there have been. We rely on Hamas propaganda in most cases for that. Shame. I would say to the Minister today that this is a bad decision. It is a decision which we will come to live to regret, and it's one which, unfortunately, I believe has been a result, maybe a lot of the pressure which Labour MPs have found in their seats as a result of Gaza protests.
True.
Well, can I say to the honourable gentleman that this party supported British fighters taking to the skies in defence of Israel when missiles were being delivered from Iran. We did that on April the 13th. This party supported the last government in their defence of Israel following the attacks we've seen from the Houthis in the Red Sea. And I would also remind him that I have not gone as far today as Margaret Thatcher went in 1982. Governments of both types, Vince Cable, Liberal Democrat, Gordon Brown, have had to make these difficult decisions. And I stand by both a party and, I hope, at a chamber that recognises the importance of international humanitarian law and the clear risk assessment that we have been required to make sure that we are not in breach of that as a country.
Chianwara. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I welcome the government's decision to suspend certain arms licences to Israel. My constituents are horrified by the unimaginable and unacceptable suffering in Gaza and certainly would not want any British exports to contribute to it. And my constituents are also horrified by the unimaginable and unacceptable suffering of the hostages held for over 11 months now, to many of whom who have been killed. Now, the Foreign Secretary will have seen the protests in Tel Aviv last night and the strikes called by Israeli labour unions to try to persuade the Israeli government to strike a deal and bring the hostages home. From his discussions with the Israeli government, what does he see as the main obstacles to a deal which brings the hostages home and which delivers a ceasefire in Gaza?
Foreign Secretary.
Well, my honourable friend asks a very good question, and Madam Deputy Speaker, she's absolutely right. What brings this to an end is a ceasefire. And the issues really boil down to the security of Israel once we get to that ceasefire. And she will have read, no doubt, the issues around the Philadelphia corridor particularly, and the ability or Israel's insistence at this stage that they should be present still in Gaza, and that being a matter of discussion. There have been previously also issues around not just the let's hope would leave this is that we are now reaching a decisive point, as Joe Biden has said. We can get there, and we need to get there to bring to an end this horror that's now gone on for many, 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 many months.
Jeremy Corbyn.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Foreign Secretary will be very well aware of the decisions made by the ICJ and the ICC. He'll also be very well aware that the world has condemned Israel for its illegal occupation of the West Bank, the settlement policy, and the killing of 40,000 people in Gaza. The suspension of some arms contracts, could he explain what effect that will actually make on Israel's ability to continue the bombardment of Gaza, or will it continue unabated? And will he also explain what role, legally or otherwise, Britain has played in overflying Gaza with surveillance aircraft and the use of RAF Akrotiri as a staging point for aircraft going to Israel, which many people believe are carrying weapons that are used to bomb Gaza?
Foreign Secretary.
I know that the Right Honourable Gentleman is informed on many aspects of these issues. He must know that our exports to Israel amount to about 1%. And in fact, it is the United States and Germany and others that are much more engaged in the selling of arms to Israel. So when he asks me the effect, he can draw his own conclusions in relation to that. I am very comfortable with the support that we give to Israel, and I won't comment on operational issues, as he would expect from this dispatch box.
Melanie Ward.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Israeli military F-16 aircraft have dropped thousands of bombs on civilians in Gaza in the last 11 months. UN weapons inspectors confirmed that this includes bombing the premises of aid agencies, Medical Aid for Palestinians and the International Rescue Committee, which housed Palestinian aid workers, international aid workers and doctors in January of this year. F-16s have further killed thousands of Palestinian civilians who had fled their homes to what the Israeli military had designated a safe zone in Al-Mawasi. Can I ask the Foreign Secretary if he will confirm that this arms ban will include licences related to the F-16 and that this is in service, if so, of upholding UK and international law and protecting civilian lives? Can I also express extreme concern at the ongoing Israeli military action in the West Bank? Earlier this year, I was in Tulkarem refugee camp after a military raid, and last year, Jenin refugee camp, days after a military raid, both much smaller than what is happening now. The West Bank and Jerusalem are at boiling point alongside the horrors in Gaza. So can I ask the Foreign Secretary, what action is he taking to uphold international law there as well?
Foreign Secretary.
Well, of course, my honourable friend brings tremendous expertise to this House on the issues on the ground, particularly in Gaza and the West Bank. Can I reassure her that we have fully assessed the export licensing regime and those weapons that might be used in the conflict, and that includes those she mentions have been excluded. She's quite right to raise the issues of deconfliction, the aid workers who have lost their lives, and I want to reassure her that I have raised these issues with the Prime Minister himself in Israel and with other members of the government, and pressed them hard on these issues. And I know, frankly, in coming into this role, that the former Foreign Secretary did exactly the same. And therefore it's on that basis in many ways that we sadly and regrettably have come to the assessment that I've had to today.
Mike Martin.
So we've had some very strong words from the Foreign Secretary today about how this war must end, and we've also heard words about how important it is that we have a ceasefire to do so, and I take him at his word. But looking forward, what levers does he have, and when is he going to pull them?
The Honourable Gentleman's new to this House, so I tread very gently. But I would urge him to reflect that in the end, to bring about peace, as we saw in Northern Ireland, you need partners for peace. And the principal partners here are Benjamin Netanyahu and Sinwar. And the deal that we have on the table can bring about that peace. And I have to tell him, in the last 8 or 9 weeks in office, I have spent more time on this issue than any other issue pressing to get that ceasefire.
Andy Slaughter.
Very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. We've seen the most serious incursions into the West Bank for 20 years, and that's under cover of the horror that is happening in Gaza, otherwise it would be leading the news. And towns like Jenin completely cut off, the water supply, the streets ploughed up in that way. What's the government's specific response to this, which is really a form of collective punishment? And has the Foreign Secretary looked at whether arms and equipment are being used specifically in the West Bank?
Foreign Secretary.
Well, can I say to my very good friend that the UK position is clear. Settlements are completely unacceptable and illegal under international law. They present an obstacle to peace and they threaten the physical viability of a two-state solution. That is why we take this so seriously, and it's why we condemn the settler violence and incitement remarks such as those that were made by Israel's National Security Minister Ben-Gvir and the Finance Minister Smotrich. All of these issues we keep under review, and all of these issues I'm discussing with our closest allies.
Ben Lake.
Speaker, amid the devastation of bombardment and the collapse in civilian infrastructure, civilians in Gaza must now contend with polio. As has already been mentioned this afternoon, to be effective, the UN vaccination programme needs to attain some 90% population coverage. Can I ask the Foreign Secretary for his assessment of the initial progress of the scheme and what steps his government is taking to help facilitate a swift and hopefully effective rollout?
Well done.
Secretary.
Well, I'm grateful to the question, Madam Deputy Speaker. It's horrendous that polio has returned after 2 decades of absence in Gaza. That is why we convened and pressed to get this pause, to get these children vaccinated in Gaza, so that we can not see a new flowering of that horrendous disease and affliction. And I hope he will commend the leadership that we've shown and the leadership we saw in the UN Security Council to bring about this vaccination programme in the last few days.
John Pearce.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. We are all desperate to see an end to the suffering on all sides in this conflict. The Iranian regime and its proxies are one of the biggest barriers to ending that conflict and achieving a sustainable ceasefire. Will the Secretary of State agree with me that tackling the threat from Iran is vital, and will he update us on his plans to prescribe the IRGC?
Foreign Secretary.
Well, I'm grateful for the question, and I would not want the House to lose sight of the further sanctions that I've announced of the 4 individuals in the House this afternoon, and you can revisit the statement just to be abreast of that. He's absolutely right about the dangers that the IRGC poses, and indeed it's been important for me in these early weeks in office to engage with my Iranian counterpart and to urge de-escalation, particularly in relation to any action that Iran is contemplating. This remains the very, very biggest and most important of issues for us here in the UK. It is absolutely right to keep it centre stage.
Ellie Jones.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The news of suspension of some export licences is indeed welcome, and I know there are many in my constituency across the country who will be glad to hear this. But I'm alarmed that it seems that the principle underpinning criterion 2C is being inconsistently applied here, and in particular the justification that the Foreign Secretary has offered for not suspending licences for the F-35 appears inconsistent. There does appear to be clear evidence of clear risk. There are online posts, I understand, from the IDF indicating that F-35s have been used in bombing Gaza. And so I'd like to urge the Secretary of State to review this case again and to suspend those licences. Can I ask him also, please, to clarify whether licensing continues for R902W Wankel engines, because they were involved in the World Central Kitchen attack on humanitarian workers? Thank you.
The Honourable Lady asked important questions around the F-35, and it is important for me to state that in looking at the F-35, it's important to understand that there is a global supply chain. She will recognise threats, very, very serious threats that exist across much of the globe in other terrible theatres of conflict. I think were she in my situation, she too would make the judgment that we should do nothing to equip those who would cause tremendous harm in relation to this decision. And that's why it has been important, never mind the ability to actually distinguish across that multiple supply chain that involves many nations, those particular equipments that those particular bits of armoury that she's talking about.
Olivia Blake.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The children of Gaza have faced an onslaught from above and now the spread of disease. And I would just like to ask that the Foreign Secretary of State considers once again bringing those who are most vulnerable to the UK for medical treatment. Polio has a lasting impact and could need a lot more support for people if they've already been infected with lifelong disabilities. We've also got children who have need amputations and life-altering operations that they haven't been able to access the right quality of care because hospitals have just not been there. Can we look at this again? Other countries are doing it. Let us be part of it.
Yeah. Foreign Secretary.
My honourable friend raises a very important issue, and that is why I and the member for Oxford East made the statements in our first weeks in office in relation to supporting UK Med and restoring the funding to UNRWA to ensure that those children get the medical aid that they need at this time. Now, I'm afraid my assessment is across Gaza, it's not sufficient for the reasons that I've discussed, but it was important that we put all the aid and money we could to that endeavour, particularly on behalf of those young children. And there's another issue that I'm tremendously concerned about. It's the amount of young people not in school. This has gone on for months, and young people must be in school.
Jim Shannon.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I thank the Minister for his answers? I defend the right of Israel to protect all of its people, the same as the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland did for its own citizens against IRA terrorism, and as Ukraine has done against Russian aggression, ever mindful of that. So our hearts ache with those hostage families who have received the news that they have feared and dreaded for almost a year, and even more forcibly underlines the need to ensure that either the hostages or the remains are brought home, and that steps can be taken for peace in the Middle East, which is all of our goal. I know it's the Minister's goal, it's the goal of everyone in this House. Will the Minister outline what further steps that can be taken along with our allies to bring this peace, this much needed peace, about? Thank you.
Foreign Secretary.
Well, can I just say to the honourable gentleman that today's decision relates to an independent process in relation to, of course, to our strategic export licensing criteria. It comes on yet another day of tremendous pain for those hostage families, and I'm acutely aware of that. And it's why I've sought to speak to those families, of course those who have a relationship with our own country, but those beyond as well, and to meet with those families when I've been in Israel. My heart bleeds for them. the pain and the suffering that they're going through is torturous. That there are so many left is unbelievable. And to have gone so many months not knowing whether your loved one is alive or dead is horrific. And anyone who looks at the front pages of the international news and looks at those beautiful young people who have been taken from us in the most horrific of ways, frankly, it brings tears to the eyes. And I feel so much, I offer my deepest condolences, and all of us do, to those families who've learnt they'd lost their loved ones over the last few days.
Apsana Begum.
The Foreign Secretary announced 30 of approximately 350 export arms licenses will now be suspended. That is still less than 10% of the total number of export arms licenses to Israel. Given that over 40,000 Palestinians have now been killed, given that Israel is expanding its military operations in the occupied West Bank, and given that a former Foreign Office official resigned, stating, and I quote, that it is actually quite clear that Israel is perpetuating war crimes in plain sight, will the UK government ensure that the UK is not complicit in Israel's war crimes and suspend all arms sales to Israel?
Foreign Secretary.
Well, I've followed the quasi-legal process that we have in this country. We've got one of the most robust regimes in the world. I stand by the decision that I've made that approximately 30 export licenses to Israel should be suspended at this time. And yes, it does represent 10% because it's the 10% that could be used in the theatre of conflict that we're concerned with. But I would also just gently say to the Honourable Lady that there are many things that we might sell that I don't think anyone would suggest a helmet or goggles we shouldn't be selling to one of our closest allies. And so you make that assessment in a measured way, in a sober way, on behalf of the British people, and I'm satisfied with the assessment that's been made.
Ayub Khan.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I welcome the Foreign Secretary's decision to withdraw some of the arms, or the licenses to arms? I'm confident, even though our arms trade is insignificant, it's bound to have a repercussion on other countries that provide arms licenses. So I certainly welcome that. But what steps can the Foreign Secretary do in liaising with his Israeli counterparts in relation to the Palestinian children which are now going to receive vaccinations for polio, and they're being moved from pillar to post without a real safe zone? Will the Foreign Secretary seek assurances that they will be given a safe zone and not blown away after giving their polio vaccinations?
Foreign Secretary.
Yes.
Catherine Frooks.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and thank you, Foreign Secretary, for your statement. I absolutely share your pain, your horror and your dismay at the number of innocent civilians killed in Gaza. I received a letter from constituents under the banner of Families for a Ceasefire recently, signed by over 70 families in Monmouthshire, calling for a ceasefire and a ban on all arms sales to Israel. So I welcome the suspension of the 30 arms licences, but could my right honourable friend share with us when the further review of the remaining licences will be available, and also look at encouraging other countries around the world to do as we have done and suspend their licences to Israel? Thank you.
Foreign Secretary.
Well, I recognise that this is a really big issue for her constituents, and I recall being in Wales a few months ago and this being raised with both of us as an issue when I was in opposition and speaking on behalf of the opposition benches. Our regime is our regime. Different countries will have different arrangements, and it is for them democratically to determine those arrangements, and they will have made a range of different assessments. And she'll also understand that, as I said, there are really only 2 or 3 countries that sell substantial amounts to Israel, and we are not one of them, in truth. The assessment that has been reached, regrettably, today, I think should satisfy all those who've been concerned with any breaches of international humanitarian law on the basis of a clear risk, which is the export licensing criteria. As I said in my statement, it is not a judgment. It is not for me or the government or any of us in this place to act as judge and jury. That is a matter for the appropriate international courts and must be determined in the usual way. And so I just emphasise it's the clear risk judgment on our export licence regime that has required me to make this judgment.
Chris Murray.
Thank you. I welcome the government's statement today, and I know that many of my constituency will as well. Our overwhelming priority must be an immediate ceasefire in Gaza. Does the Foreign Secretary agree with me that both sides must come to a table to end this conflict, and will the Foreign Office strain every diplomatic sinew to effect it?
Foreign Secretary.
Well, yes, I say to my honourable Fred, we need a ceasefire now, and it is in the hands of the major actors here to bring that about and get those hostages out, get that hostage deal. And so many families in Israel want to see that hostage deal and bring the suffering of the Palestinian people to an end so that the aid can get it in the quantities that's required. It's within our reach. I had hoped, I'll be honest with him, I had hoped that we would have reached that point by now. But we must still reach to get there over the coming days.
Rachel Maskell.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. We've been talking about polio today because tragically we've learned about how this infectious disease is taking a grip in Gaza with the tragic diagnosis that we've had. However, there are many commutable diseases within Gaza which are spreading, and therefore just focusing on polio will not be sufficient to save lives. What further steps can he take to ensure that those windows of vaccination, of treatment, and for bringing cure can be extended so more life can be saved?
Foreign Secretary.
Well, I'm very grateful to my honourable friend for raising these issues. Can I assure her that myself and my colleague, the member for Oxford East, are on these issues, that our support for all medical aid in Gaza is paramount, and that sitting alongside the medical context, of course, is the nutrition context and the threat of famine and starvation, particularly, that leads to so many medical ailments. So she's right to emphasise these issues, and I can only say to her that we continue to work, particularly the UK particularly works on this front.
Alice MacDonald.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Foreign Secretary rightly said in his statement that famine is looming ever larger in Gaza and, of course, just mentioned the issue of hunger and malnutrition. Yet the World Food Programme has only managed to bring in half the aid needed and indeed recently suspended movements of its staff after they came under attack. Can the Foreign Secretary expand on the assessment of hunger and malnutrition levels in Gaza and the specific action that the government is taking to push for unimpeded access to food aid?
Foreign Secretary.
Well, I'm very grateful to the Honourable Lady for raising this issue. It is of tremendous concern that over the last few days the World Food Programme have suspended their activities in Gaza because their own workers have come under attack for the issues of deconfliction that has been raised already in this House, given the tremendous concern across the House about nutrition, about starvation, and about famine. We will be redoubling our efforts over the coming days and working with international partners to see that people do not go without the food that would keep them from the famine status.
Matthew Patrick.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I welcome the Foreign Secretary's call for an immediate ceasefire. That's the route for hostages to be returned home and for aid to flow into all corners of Gaza. I welcome the Foreign Secretary's call for a two-state solution, the only route to a lasting peace in the region. I also welcome the clarity that there is no moral equivalence between the Israeli government and the heinous action and intent of Hamas. Can I ask the Foreign Secretary what steps can be taken to stop or stem the flow of money and aid and weapons from Iran to its proxies who are so determined to bring about Israel's total destruction?
Foreign Secretary.
Well, I'm very grateful to the tone of the Honourable Gentleman's remarks. He's absolutely right to put the spotlight on Iran, and it's why I've announced further sanctions today. It's why we keep the position of the IRGC under close review. It's why I've spoken to the Iranians twice in the last few weeks and urged de-escalation. It's why also I've been to Lebanon and met with the Prime Minister, the Speaker and others, and those who could get messages to Hezbollah. We have amongst the very best military intelligence capability in the world, working with our partners. These are issues of utmost importance in relation to global security.
That concludes that statement, and before we move on to the next statement, we'll let the front benches change over. Before I call the Home Secretary to make her statement,